Hi everyone, welcome back to Roses All Trash, the accompanying podcast to Read Community. I'm Catherine.
I'm Ryan.
And this is the first week for the month of April. Decolonization is not a metaphor.
Okay, our first reading is Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang. So this text is the namesake for this entire month's calendar and this episode to boot. To sum up this text, I'll read the first 3 sentences of the abstract. Quote, our goal in this article is to remind readers what is unsettling about decolonization. Decolonization brings about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. The easy adoption of decolonizing discourse by educational advocacy and scholarship, evidenced by the increasing number of calls to decolonize our schools or use decolonizing methods or decolonize student thinking, turns decolonization into a metaphor. Throughout this article, Tuck and Yang speak generously of activists and scholars who are, fighting for inclusivity, for representation, for cultural renewal in media, education, culture, but they also point out a clear mistake that is often made or an impulse that is often indulged by people who take decolonization metaphorically. That mistake is the settler move to innocence. And these are practices or roles that, quote, attempt to relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility without giving up land or power or privilege. This sounds, of course, like white guilt and white fragility, but it's also when white people say they're like 1/32nd Cherokee or something like that. Because that can still be true, and still that white person has done nothing to advance decolonization. And this also happens when white people adopt non-white children. The adoption itself alone is not an act of racial justice. It sounds ridiculous when we actually put those things in a sentence together, And at the end of this paper, Tuck and Yang discuss the ethic of incommensurability versus the goal of reconciliation. In their own words, quote, reconciliation is concerned with questions of what will decolonization look like? What will happen after abolition? What will be the consequences of decolonization for the settler? Decolonization is not obliged to answer those questions. Decolonization is not accountable to settlers or settler futurity. Decolonization is accountable to indigenous sovereignty and futurity. This is not an easy concept to accept, at least for me, and I've been sitting with it for a few weeks, so we'll definitely discuss this, but for now, let's go on to the next text.
Our second reading, Decolonization, A Short History by Jansen and Jürgen Osterhammel, speaking about Britain, Italy, and Japan's colonialist empire in Asia, and the way these colonies kind of changed hands between colonialist nations, but how essentially at the end of the World War, none of them were freed from the colonialist rule.
So our last reading is by Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism. And this text was written or published in 1950. So this is a couple years after the Second World War, when the post-war dust had sort of settled into this increasing global pressure to decolonize. The Discourse on Colonialism is written, I would say, in prose, and it reads almost like a speech on how destructive colonialism is and how it reveals and encourages brutality in people. It's class-minded because it frames the elite ruling class as commanding violence, the bourgeoisie as intentionally blind, politicians, pastors, and intellectuals as justifying it, bizarrely and with this self-satisfaction through this popular philosophy at that time of humanism. It condemns every one of these people as being part of a barbaric civilization that is already sick at the moment that it even decides that it wants to colonize, that it wants to, quote-unquote, civilize. Césaire talks about how there is no exchange for the, quote, increase in standard of living when it's basically just a new abuse superimposed on an old abuse. Especially when we have proof of old civilizations that were collectivist, cooperative, flawed in their own ways, and yet did not value the conquering of other civilizations. In his last bit, he says that the US in 1950 far surpasses Western Europe in barbarism, even though colonialism in terms of a historical period was mainly the British Empire versus the French Empire and the ways that they went about creating a relationship between the motherland and their colonies, and into decolonization, the ways in which they decided to let them go free and keep these deceptive leashes on them. The US in 1950 did not have that sort of footing yet. And it's really after the Second World War, as the British and French empires decolonize, that the US emerges as this good guy, as this nice guy, the bystander, the bourgeois that doesn't need to colonize in order to still be the most powerful country following the World War, which like destroyed the empires that were in power in the first place. And so this is the sort of sentiment that new radicals start with when they say decolonize, blink, because quite a lot of physical decolonization already happened in the 40s through the 90s, but there's still so much legal, economic, military, and even out and out political occupation throughout the world. And it's now all under this guise of civility, of aid, or humanitarianism, which, as Césaire says, that was always how it was. So I wanted to start with, like Tuck and Yang clearly identified that like decolonize blank is it's not just a cheap buzzword. It really means something to a lot of people. But I was wondering what you primarily learned from them about this like very sort of common yet still inspiring call to action.
A lot of history. But I think something that really, like, what stuck with me sort of as an overarching theme is decolonization, if not a metaphor. Reminding myself and like sort of relearning that decolonization was like an actual action that like has happened, and it was like a specific, like a physical literal thing that happened, literally not a metaphor. A reminder that like racial justice and social justice in general has to be concrete action rather than simply a discussion, and it has to be based in the like context of history as well, because like so much of this history, like even someone in like a liberal academic sphere like myself going through college and things like that, isn't something we learned or just talked about even when we did discuss colonialism, or like we discussed like sort of small scale parts of this, but the ongoing sort of colonialism that exists in the form of like military occupation. And like you said, I really love that phrase, like deceptive leashes that the US specifically holds on so many other like countries around the world. And what's like the literal concrete action we can take to destroy those outposts and those leashes.
I did a lot of like reading for this month as soon as I realized, oh, decolonization isn't just an idea I agree with about how like our textbooks are very skewed or the stories we're told about ourselves are very biased, and like a lot of what we learn in school is to justify this history that we feel like is unjustifiable, you know? Like that makes sense like so many things in a metaphorical way or like in an abstract way. And like learning that, oh, decolonization is like a time period in history. Like there was something that actually is called decolonization, and the reason why people are still calling for it is because it's incomplete. Like that just showed me like I needed to do a lot more research and I needed to read a lot more and prepare a lot more.
Seeing it as a period of a history that like, well, incomplete is something that like caused tangible change in the world, I think makes you see the word decolonization as like more of a inspiring call to arms. Because I mean, like you said earlier, not that I didn't think that it was important, obviously not, and I like understand that it is important to so many people, and like I believe in it. As someone who went to like art school, like you know, every critique someone's got to bring out decolonization, like toss the word in there just to make sure that like sometimes I felt like, are we really like seriously considering how and why we're using this word? And something I like what you said also is like a lot of the history that we learn is kind of an attempt to justify an unjustifiable history. And I think kind of a first step is like understanding that the history is unjustifiable, like what has happened is unjustifiable. It's kind of, you just need to accept that because we can't change it, but like we have to do what we can do to ensure that like then what we build next will not be equally unjustifiable, even when given what like we're told are like simple concrete facts in high school and things like that. It is all, like you said, like an attempt to explain and to rationalize what has happened.
Yeah, I think the word decolonization, as it is often misused, signals this kind of like adolescent awakening. Like we're all sort of coming to terms with the fact that like, oh, history books are biased, like, oh, there's such a thing as white supremacy, oh, there's such a thing as the patriarchy, and it still affects us like outside of the house, inside of the house. But that's a very adolescent place to be. We have to move on to sort of grappling with it. And part of that is why like Tuck and Yang's article was so impactful, I think, because they put it in like the clearest terms possible. They're like, I don't care what happens to the United States. It's not my responsibility to tell you like what's gonna happen after it comes apart, you know? But I don't think that's like the goal of a lot of activists, like as opposed to thinking about like what exactly do we want to replace it with. The way that decolonize, blah 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 is used now, a lot of people I think are still using it as like a reactionary term. Like this is wrong, but they won't like do the research and take the time and do the work to support people even that are saying, well, this is right, like this is what we should replace it with.
Yeah, reactionary does feel like the right word for it because it's, say, something I said earlier to a friend is we were talking about like straight white men, like liberals who are like really shitty people and like, how they manifest themselves and like, red flags or whatever. Something I was thinking about is like how it's all kind of a form of marketing, like they've learned how to market themselves better. And the use of the word like decolonization sometimes can feel like that. Like, is this like a concept that you thoroughly understand and are committed to, like the tangible actions of it and the tangible consequences of it to decolonize and take the next step? Or is this simply like the word that, like a buzzword? Is it simply marketing in terms of marketing your own theory and your own political arguments?
Yeah, I mean, of course there's a place for anger, of course there's a place for rage and personal growth, but like believe me, all the seats are taken. Like, if you're looking to get involved, like, maybe consider signing up for one of the harder jobs than just being angry. You know what I mean? I don't know. Maybe that's like really unsympathetic of me to say, but I've just had like a really tough week.
This is also like, this is my statement's more directed at like white activists and what like white liberals who like just kind of like toss in decolonization. I think like the lived experience of like people of color who deal with it in a very different way and approach it in a different way from us because obviously their lives and like what they've experienced and been through. Like I'm in no place to be like criticizing or telling them what language they should or should not use and like, whether or not it's real. But like I see a lot of like white activists and like white liberals. I'm like, okay, like decolonization, but like, do you know what that means for you? Decolonization as a tangible step means giving up resources and giving up power of white people. It's sort of a vague idea that sounds great because I think it seems like it's not actually going to happen to a lot of like white liberals. But like, are you ready to actively take those steps in your day to day life?
Yeah, that's hard too because I was listening to this interview. I don't know. It was like this financial podcast, and the host was this white woman who was like if I have kids and she wanted to have kids, she was like, I would just send them to the like the public school in the neighborhood and like try to move into like it feels like forced integration. The issue of segregated housing and segregated school districts in the US is not going to be solved by white people going into like black neighborhoods and like sending their kids to subpar schools when they could afford to go to better schools. The issue is it's going to be solved when we make reparations for the housing policies that were specifically grouping white homeowners together and then not allowing black people into these government built projects which were originally supposed to be just public housing for anybody. I'm sorry, but it's like, you know, I think like learning about decolonization as a time period in history also helps me realize like I need to keep going materialist in my politics. It's tempting and it's fun and it's like fulfilling. I think fun is the wrong word, but it's very fulfilling to participate in these like Twitter debates and be like, oh my gosh, did you see that new movie with that like new cast of color and stuff? And like, oh my god, like Michael B. Jordan is so hot and stuff. Like it can be very fulfilling to connect with people that way, but I can't stop and keep getting angry at every single stupid thing like white people do. I have to move on and like create materialist change. I don't know. I know we do like a lot of media analysis on this podcast, and that's like totally there's a place for that. But I think some people are called to it. Like that's the main thing they are supposed to do in the movement or whatever movement they're part of. I cannot be there. It's just gonna frustrate me. It's just gonna be loops and it.
I mean, that's how I feel about a lot of theory. Like, it's not that I don't think theory is relevant or that it's not an incredibly useful tool for learning to articulate and pinpoint these systems and structures that are really hard to sort of grasp. so many of the times when I've read theory, I'm like, oh wait, like I knew that was happening, but I just didn't know how to say it, or like I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And so in that way, it's been really helpful for me to be able to like identify and pinpoint what's happening and the issues and like identify tangible steps. And so theory is really life changing and a really important like revolutionary tool in that degree. But also sometimes I'm like, this is just, especially in like academic communities and academic discussions, I'm like, we're just sitting here talking. Like, what are we doing? You know, I feel this impatience. I mean, I think back to what we talked about many episodes prior, like a practice of love, and like love is like a daily practice. And that's something I think about with when it comes to social justice and like this word decolonization. It's like, what's a daily practice I can do that will like relinquish some of the power that I've been given like as a white person? Like what's like a daily step?
Yeah, I mean, let's get into that. Like, what it was tough to read Tuck and Yang because it's like, because I've never identified as a settler, right? Like, they clarify in the article like what the difference between a settler and an immigrant is. An immigrant is somebody who comes into a country and complies with their laws, is expected to integrate into the existing society. A settler comes and supersedes it, creates their own laws, creates their own economies, their own like value, puts their own values. Like, so I've never like identified with that, but I was like, well, I still live here though. Like, I still live here and I don't belong here. Like, it comes down to even this segregated housing and like how to integrate, you know? And there's people being like, well, people are comfortable with like people of their own skin color and stuff. And like, I can see that, but also like, it's very obvious in, if you look at history, that like, that's not how people were living before these segregating housing policies.
Yeah. And that specific point, that's always so funny to me. Like people are like, oh, like people are just like more comfortable with people who look with them. I'm like, why do you think that is? Like,
Exactly. Yeah. Like, no, it's true, but that's because I don't want white people to like call me racist names, you know? Like, also with black people, like a lot of black people that I met in New York, like you can tell they really haven't like been friends with Asian people very much. Like maybe they had a few Asian people at their school or something. It was just this like social divide, and like that's not really that conducive to like feeling close and intimate with somebody, you know?
and I think also like for me, there's like a big difference between people feeling more comfortable with people who like look with them or like are the same racial makeup out of like a sense of like, punching up versus punching down. Like there are definitely like, black people I know who are friends with like almost exclusively black people. Like I know them like loosely, but like we're not like close friends. And I'm like, yeah, like I kind of get why you do that. Like I wouldn't want me there either. Like most of the vast majority of my friends are women because like that's like who I feel comfortable with. Like women, like non-binary people, just essentially like not really cis men because that's like who I feel like comfortable and who I'm able to feel more like vulnerable with. Whereas with men, I'm always like it's much harder for me to like bring that guard down. So I'm like, yeah, like kind of makes sense that
Yeah, and of course this isn't true for everyone. And of course there are counterexamples. Like, of course I have cis men friends. Like,
yeah,
of course I have white friends. Like, of course I have black friends or whatever. The fact that like you have a more immediate connection with somebody doesn't mean that like that's natural. Like there like you said, there are reasons. But it like, I mean, it comes to a way more serious point when you think about like black people who did eventually move into suburban white neighborhoods and how they were literally stoned out of their houses, murdered in their own homes. Like, you know, there are reasons.
this also like this makes me think of again a previous episode we had where we were talking about like Native American courts of law and the idea of like community rule. And I had mentioned like my elementary school and how like us kids like in the classroom made up the classroom rules and it was called like the classroom like constitution or the contract or something, and like we all signed our names to it after we had like brainstormed in groups what the rules would be and so on and so forth, and like this collaborative effort we put in to create our own like system of governments, but that still like somehow those rules were still applied differently to the kids who were in the racial minority in the class, and how it kind of goes back to like the self-perpetuating cycle. These communities like if there isn't diversity within it from the get go and like from the foundation of it, and like significant diversity more than just like, oh, we have like, one Asian person and one black person and like a bunch of white people. I remember thinking in my head, I'm like, I really feel like when it comes to like these racial divides and like creating communities that are like truly more equitable, I think the issue is like white people should never be allowed to be the majority, like ever. They always need to be like the minority for that to work. We shouldn't be allowed to travel on tax.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, it's not just about people like living side by side. Like, even at your school where a lot of things were more equitable or were more diversity minded, whatever, like, there needed to be actual shifts of power. It won't help if, like, there's a bunch of different colored people living in a neighborhood. Like, those people actually have to actively shift power and have, like, their perceptions of each other changed or challenged constantly.
And that's something when I think about like reparations, especially. It's not just like, white people, like there's been white supremacy and like they've had the power and like we need to bring people of color up here. I feel like people of color in general, specifically like BIPOC, like need to be like up here, if that terrible visual makes sense, for that to like fully to ever come close to creating a more equitable world.
Yeah, I honestly don't know how I feel about that. Much like Tuck and Ying, they say at the end of their article, like the decolonization framework can't even really work if we know what's going to happen at the end. They were like, not only is it not our responsibility, but like if we know what's going to happen, it won't work. To clarify, I mean, like, it's not really my job to be imagining what like an equal society looks like. It's my job to get there. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like, I'm not gonna spend time like fantasizing or whatever, or like coming up with my own idea of like this. Yeah, I'm not like world building, you know? Like, my job is to make sure I'm contributing to policy that like disperses reparations and doesn't create any or doesn't like perpetuate any more unfair housing policy and like doesn't perpetuate unfair education policy and
Yeah, and like any vision of the world, any world building I could do that like about like equity and like social justice and stuff is like it's already going to be shaped by like my internal biases, like no matter how much time I spend addressing them. So like if I knew the answer, that would like you said, like it would be wrong. It would not work because I don't think I'm like capable of conceiving of a world outside of these structures of oppression, which obviously does not mean we should stop trying, but like worth time and energy to be like, this is how I imagine my like dream world to be, when everything's
yeah.
gonna be okay for everyone.
It just like sounds too much like those guys like on Reddit or whatever where they're like, if we just had universal basic income, like everything, like no. Like nothing, like the world isn't going to change because of one policy. Like it literally doesn't work that way.
Yeah. It's like that one policy is a start, but like it's not gonna be
Hmm.
like, boom, okay, we're done. It's congrats guys, we did it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Like world change doesn't happen to like make you feel better. Like again, that's like prioritizing this like settler move to innocence. Like you can feel like something has changed. We were going to talk about like what we do or like what we feel like can be done every day to decolonize in a materialist way.
I feel like for me money is a big part of that, which like maybe is kind of like the easy way out. Donating to GoFundMe's and organizations, but also like, sending money to my friends who are like people of color, specifically like BIPOC, and and just like things like, oh, like if I can buy coffee for them like while we're out, like if I can like do a small thing to help them out, like yes, that's the most like immediate tangible thing I feel like I can do.
I'm always like a straight to the point type of person. So, like, and I think I'm in the position to do that. Like, I majored in public policy, right? Like, I want to go into law. I want to go into international law specifically and deal with like, arbitration between people of different nationalities and stuff. And so, like, I can kind of afford, it's not really a privilege, but it's more like I'm in the place to be like, oh, I think like one of the things that I could do is like make sure to study like indigenous rights to like and their place in western systems. Or another thing is like there's like decolonization work to do in the US, but there's also decolonization work to do abroad. And whatever country that I have an affinity for, like Korea is one, the two Koreas definitely are a place where I can read more about, learn more about. That's where I can like start donating to groups that I believe are like doing the right thing in terms of kind of giving Koreans back sort of repossession, political repossession of their land. And I like love Laos. Like I was there for a week and I just loved the culture there. It like actually reminded me a lot of like my maternal grandparents' city, I guess, town. It's more suburb now, but it was rural when my mom was growing up basically. And just because I'm not from Laos doesn't mean that I can't do legal work in Laos or like donate or something to like causes that are related to Lao people, like I can, you know. This is more fraught when there's like that stereotype of like the white guy who's like he's like an East Asian studies major or whatever. But like I don't know, like do you like just do the right thing? I don't know. I also did a lot of reading on Orientalism for this month. Orientalism now is considered like a way of thought, like a way of thinking about Asian people, basically, or people in the now Middle East. But when it was like booming, it was actually a study. It was like the study of Asia and the study of people in Asia and the Middle East and stuff. And it was all these white guys who like, you know, mainly went into like learn how to govern their like colonial subjects better.
Yeah, my uncle was always obsessed with like East Asia, but like at least he like lived there for like many years, and that's like where he met his wife and like raised his kid till his kid was like in middle school. So I'm like, at least you like committed. You're like, I think it's cool, so I'm gonna like move there and learn the language and live there for like several decades.
Yeah, I think like people would say that's also a form of like colonialism because like
Fair
the
enough, yeah.
whole policy in the beginning of like actual colonialism in like the 1800s, 1700s was to make it super easy for citizens like of England and France to move to their colonies. And like a lot of the people who moved were entrepreneurs. It's quite different from your uncle who became like an English tutor. But like
And also moved back to Idaho a couple years ago, so like he's back where he came from. So
I mean, it is what it is. Like he can't feel guilty forever. Like his wife and his kids are people too.
yeah.
They're not just like products of colonialism, you know.
In terms of colonization, did I tell you about the time one of my classes had us write an essay by like pulling two random words out of a bag? We had to write an essay about the two words and like draw them together in some way. And it was like our final. It was kind of this foundation class on like on being human is what it was called. A lot of it was about like religion and like religions around the world and like kind of how humans have justified and manifested their existence in so many different ways. And it was really, really interesting. But the two, for our final essay, we had to pull two random words out of a bag and write an essay about them, which I thought was honestly a really interesting prompt. But like some people got like foot and then like milk, like random things like that. But I pulled opium and then imperialism. And I was like, oh, this is, yeah. I'm like, okay, so we're all set. Feels like there's
What
an
did you
easy
write
answer.
about?
The British import of opium into China, and their intentions, which were bad to say the least. I mean, yeah, it was a pretty simple essay, obviously huge simplification, but they were like, we're just gonna deliberately try and get everyone in China addicted to opium so that we can exploit them.
I wish that I was more because I don't have Twitter or Instagram anymore, really. So I don't know anything about like the Meghan Markle shit. But like, I wish I knew about it right now so I could talk about it. Like, it seems timely, but I don't know anything about it.
Did you see the Oprah interview?
No, I didn't. Do you want to talk about it?
Oh, people's reactions to it are kind of interesting, I guess. But they're, I guess it's more or less what you would expect. I think the standout thing from the interview was like, members of the royal family were like, oh, how dark will the baby be when it's born? And that was a big deal for the obvious reasons. The other thing that happened is that Meghan Markle's son, I believe his name is Archie, when she was pregnant with her son, and she was like feeling suicidal, they were like, we can't help you. You're just gonna have to deal with it. And then they also told her that her son would like with tradition, her son would have a title and also a like personal security detail, which is obviously important because they're like members of the royal family and they get death threats all the time and have stalkers. They told her that they were changing the tradition so that her son would not have a title and also that she and her son would not have any security detail.
That's so blatant. That's just like straight up like, we hope you die. Like, we hope you and your son die. If not by your hand, then by someone else's. Like,
And she was like, that's crazy. She's like, I don't even care about whether or not like my son has a title. She's like, it's not my choice to decide for him. Like when he's old enough, he'll make a decision about whether or not he wants to try and like be an active member of the like royal family or not. And then yeah, and then people picked her on like a ton of all this shit where she's like, oh, I didn't research my husband like before I met him. And everyone's like, that's stupid. Of course you knew like researched him. Which like honestly, I believe her. Like everyone has a vague idea about the royal family, but like she probably didn't Google him. Like,
Especially if I were meeting someone that famous, I would try not to so I wouldn't come off creepy.
yeah, I feel like I don't need to know when his birthday is after we've met once. Like,
I already seen so many photos of him, like
yeah.
just by accident.
Although I think Prince Harry, her husband, I think like, well, obviously I'm sure he's a flawed person who is not perfect. I think he might actually be like a semi-relevant example of like active decolonization and giving up of power. Because like he talks about how like in the interview he was like, I did what any like good husband and like good father would do, is like my wife and like my child were unsafe and I did what I had to do to get them out of that situation. And like that's what matters. And I'm like, yeah, that's what matters. Like you said earlier, like way back at the beginning of the episode, like people think like, oh, adopting like a black child or like an Asian child, like white parents adopting, like that in itself is not radical. It's not decolonized. It's like nothing, you know? Um, and like often biracial marriages with like white people, like there's like the potential, or relationships, obviously, who am I to comment on someone else's life? But like there's the potential for that, things I've seen on the internet of like people of color discussing their like white partners and how like, they're my like white partners, like my in-laws are like racist and my partner's just like, well, that's just how it is. Like just like once a year at Christmas, grin and bear it. And it's like that violence that like they're inflicting on their own partner by being complicit. Whereas like Prince Harry was like, okay, so we're out. Like, bye bye.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. And it's like even more poignant that I'm using that like emotional word specifically because you can't help like what pressures are on you. But I agree, like at that point, then you should admit to yourself you're not ready to be in a biracial relationship. Like you shouldn't, you can't support this person, then you should stick to what you can support. Like it's kind of a similar decision as to like if you like meet somebody who wants to be a stay-at-home parent and you're not prepared to financially support the both of you and your family, then like you guys aren't meant to be. If you can't defend your like spouse of color against your white family, like you're not meant to be.
Yeah. And like obviously there are like so many layers to like stigma around biracial relationships and stuff like that. But that's really like the root issue, I think, is that like people think that they can have those relationships without any racial baggage, like between them and their like in-laws on both sides, and also like between the two of them, like that it still exists. Like it doesn't go away just because you're in a romantic relationship.
Definitely. Like baggage and like straight up violence are a little bit different. Like when you're a person of color, it's like unrealistic to think you can still demand it, of course, but it's unrealistic to think that no one's ever gonna like discriminate against you, like ever. It's just not like I don't think anyone expects that. However, conflict doesn't have to turn into like this permanently damaging incident. Like maybe like out of ignorance, the in-laws will say something and like hopefully you're in a situation and you are both people on each side that can like talk about it in a way that is fulfilling. A mistake doesn't have to turn into like trauma. And it's like for sure the people in power that have to remember that responsibility and like carry it through. I don't know, it's hard, but like I feel like Prince Harry's like doing okay. I don't know.
He seems okay. He seems about as good as you can get. Like we can't expect perfection, but like if he's doing his best, and his best is like I think pretty decent. I mean, yeah,
I mean, in terms of like straight up decolonization, though, he like did go to Canada, which is like in the Commonwealth. So like,
yeah. That's true. It's also like I feel like it's hard for a member of literally the royal British family to be a decolonizer. They like literally invented colonization.
yeah,
Damn, whack. Yeah, imagine your family literally having invented colonization. But yeah, that's like I'm sixth generation Californian. If you go way back, my like family, like way back through my mother's, it's like Portuguese. When I was little, I was like, that is so cool. Like I would tell
your
people
mom is
all the time,
Portuguese.
like way back, like like at this point it's like Portuguese, French, like all this other
Oh,
stuff,
I see.
you know. But it's yeah. I was like, that is so cool. We've been in California a long time. And then I got older, I'm like, oh, we were just like I'm like, oh, that just sucks. That's just
Yeah, someone was a settler.
yeah, I'm like, okay, great.
Like something that has stuck with me for so long is I was watching this YouTuber. She's Vietnamese, and I think she grew up in Australia. and then because her parents were Vietnamese refugees to Australia, and then she moved to Singapore. So she's now living in Singapore. And she was doing a 23andMe, and she was like, I hope there's some French in there. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, what? She's like, there might be some French there. I was like,
Yeah, that's also like, yeah, like white people who are like, ooh, I'm like one like 23rd or whatever, like, Cherokee.
yeah, it's this settler move to innocence. It's like, oh, this is also common in like colonialism then, like in the 1800s, and the way that like white people justify their presence here now is this Indianization, is like what it's called in American terms, I guess. Like you actually want to become a little bit like the people you're colonizing to justify that you're there. It's like this like, or it's like white people, they're like, oh, I grew up in the hood, like all around all these black Asian people do this too. Like they're like, oh yeah, all my friends are black and stuff. Like you Indianize yourself in order to justify your presence there. I don't know. Ever since I was like beginning to learn about like justice and liberation and stuff like that, like way back when I was like in middle school, people who over justify themselves, I like it just came from a logical standpoint. I was like, that means you feel like you have something to justify. Like you're bending over backward around this issue that you can clearly see, you know?
Yeah, I mean that's something that like personally took me a while to come to terms with, like the white guilt and stuff, where you're like, okay, like it's not constructive to try and like justify it away. Like it literally like it exists, it happened. Like what am I gonna do about it right now? You know? There was something I remember, this is back from like good old high school Tumblr days. People talked about like the idea of like sort of oppression tourism, like white people specifically who are like, ooh, like I grew up in the hood, like, all my friends are black, and it's like this sort of identity of oppression where it's like you're dipping your toe in it and you're like, yeah, I'm here like for the fun parts, but it's only something that they actively choose to participate in because they know they can always like drop it when they need to.
Yeah. I think that is more along the lines of appropriation
Yeah.
because it's like signaling to people, or it's like, you actually do appreciate something about the culture and that's why you're pretending it's your own. Like that's appropriation. Whereas like this, like, I don't want to use this word anymore, like Indianization, like is like about actually making yourself feel like you belong here, which is ridiculous. Like if you, Catherine Shark, were like, I belong here. Like that's ridiculous. Like or me being like, oh yeah, like I don't know. I mean that makes less sense because it's like literally untrue, but like,
My like long term life goal is like to move to France one day, just so I could be like, you know what, back where I came from.
That's the thing is like then there's like all this like proxy fight, and I think of it as like on the side. Like I think of it as honestly irrelevant to the main issue. People are like, well, then should everyone go back where they came from? And then there's like a lot of black activists who are like, Africans belong in Africa, and obviously a lot of black Americans are like, what the fuck? Like where would I even go? You know? Um, to me, these are all again trying to find like one policy that'll fix everything, but it won't. Like we have to actually come to terms with like what happened here on this land to these two people here, and people back then and people in the future. Like we actually have to figure it out. We can't just be like send everyone back where they came from, or let people live in the same neighborhoods or whatever. Like, or I'm gonna let my white kid go to the black school. Like, no, it's not gonna work.
I was talking with my dad about politics a while ago, which way we vote and stuff like that. He's like, whenever there's a policy that affects Native Americans, I just like look up what like local Native American groups have like said that they wanted, and I just vote that way. Because he's like, at this point, whatever they want, like it's just whatever. Like,
Your dad is consistently on the right side of history.
he's like, it doesn't matter to me. Just take whatever you want.
Like that, I mean, that is decolonization work as well. It's a little bit passive, but like it's like actually doing more than people who are just saying decolonize your textbooks or whatever. Like there are organizations, I think literally called decolonize your textbooks. Like it's youth led, it's like about providing approved textbook lists to schools and stuff. That's pretty productive. However, just using a hashtag versus like voting for native rights and voting for like what indigenous people support, like that is honestly like one of the realest ways that you can decolonize as well. What's your dad's name?
Ken.
Ken?
Yeah.
I thought it was Ken, but I thought I had it wrong. I thought I was thinking of a different Ken. I was like, oh, no, that's a different Ken.
Kenneth Wayne. My uncle's name is Glenn, and my little sister said that when she was little, she thought that Glenn was short for Gwyneth because it would be Kenneth and Glenn.
My little sister is changing her name. It's a name completely unrelated to her current name in either English or Korean.
What she changed it to?
Juno.
That's kind of cool. That's like the Greek goddess.
Oh, that's true. I didn't think of it that way. I just
That's
thought
like the
of the
best
movie.
goddess, honestly.
Really?
Yeah.
She's very flawed.
That's like the virgin goddess. She's like, she and her like lesbian friends.
No,
hate
it's
men.
not. It's not. No, Juno is the wife of Zeus. Yeah. She's like one of the worst ones. Should we talk about Greek mythology? Because when I was at private elementary school, we had readers, right? So we started with like Anne, Kat, and Sam, but then once you got into like the third grade plus readers, it was all Greek mythology. And so it was like in my curriculum that I know everything about them.
I learned a lot about Greek mythology. Also, like a lot of my own accord. We had this big book about it, and like I read all the, we were into it.
I have a book as well.
And it's something that like, was this like a hyper specific cultural thing, like a childhood cultural thing? Because I see things online where people are like, oh, I'm such a nerd, like I know all about like Greek mythology and like Hephaestus and like Aphrodite and stuff. And I'm like, everyone knows that. Like, was that not common knowledge?
I wonder what it is. I think like I mean, in other countries we have like childhood stories, so maybe it's like Greek mythology is just part of the canon as like Disney movies are.
I think so. Like, I think in American culture, it is like it's so ubiquitous. And also we're obsessed with like ancient Rome and like Greece.
I mean, I had to read the Iliad and the Aeneid, so
I have not read the Iliad or the Odyssey, so I feel like I should because like everyone's like,
Odyssey is a third thing, right? It's not the same as the Aeneid.
I
No,
don't,
it's
I
not.
don't know. I haven't
There are
read
three
them.
different stories. There are three different stories. Who's your favorite, I don't know, god or goddess?
I like Artemis.
You like Artemis? You know, she's a very angry goddess.
So am I. I'm really bitchy.
Do you think you have a lot of anger?
That's what people at work tell me. They say that I'm mean to the customers.
Really?
Yeah, I was talking to Scott. He's like, well, you've improved a lot since you've got here, but you're really mean. He's like, I'm not very good with customers, and even I was like, chill. Well, I don't know. I can be very neutral, and in a customer service setting, that's read as like outright aggressive, especially like as a woman. When I'm unhappy, I act like pretty neutral and like calm and reserved. Like it's not like I'm yelling at someone or snapping, but I'm just very like, you know. And when you meet a woman in a customer service setting, you expect it to be like, ebullient, cheerful.
Okay, anyways. My favorite Greek figure is. Oh, I love stuff like the Minotaur. Like, I love monsters who had like one purpose and they like basically just serve as a plot device in the actual mythology, but then people are like me are enamored with them and then like give them these full backstories which are now part of the canon. Like people have feelings about Medusa when she's really just a side character, you know?
Yeah. I was literally going to say, like, what about Medusa? Although, to be fair, like, apparently Medusa, like, her head was used to signify, like, women's shelters and stuff.
No, that's what I mean. Like that happened after, you know? People like saw the significance of Medusa, and I would say like other than like the obvious reading of Medusa, where she's like just a straight up monster or whatever, like women's reactions to her or women's organizations' reactions to her have been like the same for hundreds of years. They like see something freeing in her.
It's like Gone Girl.
Exactly, like Gone Girl. I also like the story of Perseus. He was before Heracles, and I don't know if they're related. He might be the grandfather. I don't know. But Perseus also had like a lot of strength, and he was just like a really like bright shining, like think Achilles type of figure. And he like rescued
The woman chained by the ocean from
the woman chained to the ocean because she was like the daughter of
the king who had angered.
Neptune. Yeah.
Have you read Autobiography of Red about Heracles? It's this like poem. It's like the book is like yay thick, but it's this long poem Anne Carson is the woman who wrote it. It is a verse novel based loosely on the myth of Giron and the 10th later of Heracles. But it's written from the point of view of Giron. When Giron was little, he loved to sleep, but even more, he loved to wake up. He would run outside in his pajamas. Hard morning winds were blowing life bolts against the sky, each one blue enough to begin a world of its own. The word each blew towards him and came apart on the wind. Giron had always had this trouble. A word like each, when he stared at it, would disassemble itself into separate letters and go. A space for its meaning remained there, but blank. The letters themselves could be found hung on branches or furniture in the area. What does each mean? That's not my favorite quote, but it's just a quote.
Oh, is it kind of like a Caliban type of thing?
Yes, but it's really, really good. It's about his childhood and growing up and his family and like this like romance that they have and his life. But it's really beautiful. It's one of my all-time favorite books, and I think you'd really love it.
I mean, at this point, we can't not talk about the Song of Achilles. Have you read that?
I have not read it, but I've heard of
You
it.
need to read it. You need to read it. I haven't read Circe. I think that's how you pronounce it. Which people say was better. I don't know. The Song of Achilles is like a straightforward romance. It's so good. It's so good. I had like a friend who was high key homophobic, like straight up. He was just homophobic. But he read the Song of I told him to read the Song of Achilles, and he was like, I cried my way through it. Like the gay romance got to him.
I need to read it. I've heard like so many wonderful things.
Oh my god, it's so beautiful. Like it's just really beautiful. In terms of other like stories that I really like are the one of Argus, I think. He has the 100 eyes on his body. He only needs to close two at a time to sleep.
And then he gets bored to death. I can't remember which hero, so he can steal the peacock that belongs to Hera.
Or she turns him into a peacock.
Oh,
She's
that's right.
keeping someone caged, I think a woman. And then also the story of Io. Again, it's kind of the same plot here. Like chains her up or whatever. Um, and then Io turns into a cow. I don't know, this is all disjointed. The memory space in my head is getting depleted. I feel like I need to like move a bunch of things to the trash, but I don't know how.
Yeah, we've gotten a far cry off of decolonization.
No, I know, but even like stuff like this, like I used to find like so fascinating and like so like drag me in so much. Sort of like cross cultural references and like art and literature and stuff, because like to me it again shows this like connection between like people in different places of different times. I don't know, maybe I just like indulged myself too much when I was younger or something, and now I have no stamina. Even though like those things are like objectively beautiful and I can still see the appeal, like to me, like it's like I lost my taste for them or something.
I feel like a very old person who like has started to like lose their memory of things like how to find the way home or something. Or like my brain feels like a car that keeps like sputtering and like starting and stopping and starting and stopping. I'll get a good couple minutes of a run in and I'll be able to like pull
Yeah.
in these references and have a like engaged conversation and a coherent thought for an amount of time, and then it sputters out suddenly.
Part of it is like a lack of excitement. Like there was a moment when I was doing the research for this episode, like reading all about like the decolonization as a time period, and I was like, oh, this is like kind of nice because I know what has already happened. Like I know what people have done, and like people have been able to sort of like wrangle it into a history that I can now read. I don't know, maybe it's just like the time of day or like what my mood is like right now or something. But you know how people are like, this meeting could have been an email?
Theory makes me feel that way a lot. Like it's not that it's not beautifully written, and it's not that it's not important in art. Like I appreciate the how articulated it is, and like how like I said earlier, like oftentimes it's a great tool for allowing me to pinpoint and articulate a phenomena that I wasn't able to really do like explain before. That's all great, but sometimes I'm like, you could have said this in two sentences.
I definitely feel that way about a lot of theory, but then I try to understand, like, oh, maybe they're like explaining for people who aren't me. Like, they're explaining for other people, which makes sense. I don't really get that feeling from theory yet. I'm sure I will at some point, but did feel that way about like a lot of social media stuff. And like, I really never thought I would be this person who is like, I don't need to see it. I'm opting out. Like, I really don't care. But I have become this person.
When people talk about like raising awareness about specific policies or specific events or things like that, obviously that's all very important. But like you said on social media, like these simple posts that are like, here's how like XYZ is bad, you know, or like, because like racism manifests itself in these ways. I'm just like, yeah, like I know. I mean, I can't bitch. I mean, I often like do learn really relevant things, but sometimes I'm just like, yeah, what are we doing about it? I don't know. Think back to what you said a long time ago about how like when you repost things about social media and or on social media about like social justice and activism, you try and only repost things that feel like intentional, like it's a letter out to the world that you feel. And while I'm not trying to say that, like, I don't repost things about certain events or certain policies or certain GoFundMe's because I don't think they're important, that's not it at all. It's not that I think that they're lesser, but I was thinking about that recently in terms of like, am I really like posting things on my story because like I think it's actually critical information that will help the people who are going to see it? Or am I just doing it because it's the thing to do and I don't want people to think that I don't care, you know?
I think something I said in that episode is that if you're not really fully engaging with it, then you're kind of doing it a disservice, like that GoFundMe or that carousel of words mean something to somebody. And like if I'm just posting it because I feel like it's the bare minimum information, like sometimes I'll catch myself going over stuff with a critical eye as opposed to like a desiring to learn type of mindset. I'm like, let me see if anything in here is wrong before I post it, as though like posting it is a requirement that can only be evaded if something in the thing is wrong. Like, no, I don't have to post anything. I could actually just learn from it and like it and scroll past it, you know? I think actually this might have to do with like basically graduating college and like not being there anymore. I'm realizing like the world is not just us and people our age. People have full time jobs doing work related to everything I'm interested in, and I would rather try to figure out what exactly they do with 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, than keep getting angry at stuff.
That's how I feel a lot like with like right now as I work in a cafe, like it was really easy in college to be like, oh, we're gonna have all these like great debates in class and like talk about theory and have these discussions on like our plans for the world and like what's gonna fix it, etc. And it's not like that's not like, that doesn't have its pros. But it's like in the real world, like there are just people who just work to just get by just because they have to. And like every day they need to make money so they can feed themselves. Like it's a means to an end. They're not lesser because of that, you know? They're just existing and they're just getting through. And it's also like I could go in there and I could talk about like all my theories and like, all my like political thought, they just be like, okay, you're behind on the drinks. Get started, like and it's not that they don't care or that they're not like smart enough or not interested. It's just that like they have to face the realities of their life. So it's not even that like I don't discuss those things with them or like don't have those conversations on some level with them, but also you have to acknowledge that like people have to deal with the reality of the world around them and like their day to day reality.
I don't think you were even talking about complacency. I feel like this is a testament to how theory doesn't radicalize its lived experience, and like ultimately the quality of your relationship with the people that you engage in working class politics and politics that matter, that is where it all is. I've always said that like you criticizing somebody like literally doesn't matter at all and has no place if you don't have a personal relationship with them, because it's not going to go anywhere. It's like it's not gonna like bring them to like a lightning bolt or light bulb moment or whatever. Like you have to have a personal relationship with somebody for anything you say to matter in their life. And yes, there are like meet cutes or whatever, or the political version where you just like run into somebody and you like change their mind about something. But like we have to stop romanticizing that. I think that's lazy as well. That's so lazy. How can you think that like you're gonna have this great impact on somebody as like a wise person, like an untouchable person? It's kind of the same thing as like people often like to adopt this sort of persona, like when they walk into a room or whatever, they want to be the person who like changes the atmosphere. I guarantee you that is totally based on chance. It doesn't have to do anything, like it has very little to do with you. In the same way, like you can't expect to be this person walking through life like dispersing wisdom to people. You have to build relationships, you have to build coalitions, you have to build community, and then that is what's going to invest people, if not for themselves, for you.
Yeah. There's such an arrogance to that mindset of like, oh, like I know the answer. Like I've seen the light. Like I know what the answer is. Like I know the truth. and like they just need to listen to me, and then they'll understand, and I'll change everything. And like you said, like you don't have that personal relationship. Like so many, going back to like white people and like their racist relatives, you're like, oh, like if someone's like in their 30s and they have these like opinions, it's because they've had 30 years of those opinions and prejudices being reinforced over and over and over every single day. It's probably going to take another 30 years of daily work to change that, or like at least a pretty significant amount of time. And like you have to be willing to put in that work. And it's not even like the work isn't just like, oh, I'm gonna have an argument with my like low-key racist uncle at Thanksgiving, and like I'll be a little uncomfortable, but I'm doing it for like social justice. It's like your uncle, like who you see once a year, probably isn't gonna be that affected. Like you're not going to like change his mind in those like 20 minutes.
There's other reasons to have that conversation, right? Like if you want to go off and hurl verbal abuse at a racist, like I don't know about it, so I'm not looking. So or it can be like somebody else in the room needs to hear it or something like that. Like for sure, many reasons, but make sure you're actually doing it like for the reason you think you're doing it. If you think you're doing it because you're going to change this person's life, blah 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 blah, like think again. Like people are actually people. They're not babies, they're not specimens, they're not movies. Like people are actually people, and like that's where the power is. And if like you can't see that, and if you can't appreciate it and actually go for it, like you look like somebody who's like can't tell the difference between a dollar bill and a Kleenex. Like you're not seeing the value where it is.
And you're condescending yourself.
For real. Academics have their place for sure. Like just again, I feel like I say this like in every single episode. I'm like, why can't you just admit it? Like what is wrong with just being what you are? Like you're completely valid. Like stop being insecure. You're fine. You're doing good. Like it's okay.
Like why waste all your energy denying that there are issues when you can just like start working on the issues? Like
Yeah, work on them, admit them, like maybe become what you secretly want to become. Just like
yeah, being the person you want to be takes practice, and you got to start.
thank you for watching. This was the first episode for the April calendar for Read Community. I'm Ryan.
I'm Catherine.
And you can follow our socials at Roses All Trash. You can follow me at RRRYN and Catherine at Catherine.shark. See you next week.